Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie, welcoming today a discussion about the Sudan and the crisis there, trying to dig a little bit deeper and understand how it impacts us here at home. Joining us in a moment will be Christopher Tounsel, Associate Professor and Interim Director of the African Studies Program at the University of Washington. He's a historian of modern Sudan. And I really like what his bio says, which is race and religion as political technologies. And we'll get into this also about Sudan, because there's so many things. I feel that Sudan is not framed in a great way here in the West, especially when you're just doing, 2-minute sound bites. And we'll talk to Chris about this and more in a moment. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. I really appreciate your time and your recent piece about Sudan that really laid the framework for me for understanding this current conflict. We are in day 26, according to Al Jazeera. I've been following and reading their news and commentary. I encourage our audience to go to Al Jazeera because I think that's one of the better purveyors of information about what's going on in Sudan. And I'd like to hear from you, Chris, where you think we should go for information. But the first place that I'd like to start is really your piece in the conversation, which is called The Conversation, theconversation.com. Sudan's plunge into chaos has geopolitical implications near and far, including for U.S. strategic goals. And here at the Doorstep, we're always trying to make sense of the world for our audience at their doorstep, and why it's so important for us to pay attention to what's going on around the world, beyond the snippets that we might see on broadcast news, to really get into it. And your piece, I think, laid it out really well, of what the U.S. should be doing, could be doing, hasn't been doing. And, if maybe you can walk us through and explain to the audience truly, and I know you can't do 5,000 years of history in 30 minutes, but I think that we need to understand the legacy of colonialism and what it's wrought today, and where we stand as the U.S. against two very big vested interests that we're in conflict with, one is being Russia, the other being China. I think we need to understand that, and I don't think people really grasp that. And I'm going to say one last thing and then throw it to you, but it is about hashtag follow the money. We need to also follow the money here. And so your piece does that also really well. But if you could take us back to maybe some of the origins, if not, not all of them, but some of the origins of what is happening today, and then where we stand today.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so in terms of the origins, I think we can start with where Sudan is physically located, right? It is at the nexus of several regions in Africa. It is immediately to the south of Egypt, right? It is across the Red Sea from Saudi Arabia, right? And it borders several countries, right? In Central Africa, North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and East Africa. And so it is in some ways a crossroads. But economically speaking, to your point, it's very important for several reasons. It is a major producer of gold. It is a major producer of oil. And one of its natural geographic features, which is very important and has actually been economically important for the last 150 years, is its access to the Red Sea, right? So Sudan has a several hundreds miles long coastline on the Red Sea, which means that a good 10 to 20% of the world's trade, right, goes through the Red Sea and through either side, right? Including the Suez Canal to the north. Sudan was an English colony from 1899 until 1956, and became independent in 1956. But it's had a pretty tough go of it in terms of its post-colonial history. This is not the first coup that it has had. It has had coups, and this is just off the top of my head right now, but in 1958, 1969, 1983, obviously in 2019, the one that saw the overthrow of the 30-year reign dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir in 2021, right? And once again on April the 15th, when these two men at the helm have been basically struggling, if you will, to maintain military supremacy. And so a lot of the kind of economic effects of this conflict, right, to your point, stretch to places as far as China and the U.S., but also Russia, right? But I'm sure that we'll get into that as well. So I hope that that helps.
I think that's really great. I want to reference, Nick, if you remember the class we took at Georgetown, Map of the Modern World, which talked exactly about geography and the importance of geography. If I could, I put up a map to show not only the Red Sea and the surrounding area, but because that's exactly where we're seeing refugees going. So people understanding the refugees are going to Egypt, refugees are going to Ethiopia, refugees are going to South Sudan. And by the way, there are refugees that are double refugees because they were refugees in Sudan and now they're going back to South Sudan. And so maybe also a little bit of historical perspective on Sudan and South Sudan, which seceded or 2011
Mhm.
voted for independence, because I think that also plays an important role when we're looking at the map, which, as you say, is so important.
It plays a huge role, right? So the world's newest nation state is the Republic of South Sudan, which, as you just mentioned, became independent in 2011. And it became independent after two very long and very devastating civil wars. To make a long story short, when Sudan became independent from British colonialism in 1956, the new independent Sudanese government wanted to forge the Sudan along Arab and Islamic lines, right? And so there were multiple attempts to kind of institute Islam as the religion of state, right? Efforts to kind of have these forced Arabization policies as well. And this was really something that a lot of people in South Sudan did not jive with because despite the fact that Islam has a 1,000+ year history in the Sudan, we know that in South Sudan it is not the same, and that for much of the colonial period, British missionaries purposefully sent Christian missionaries to be sent to South Sudan in a kind of Victorian effort to quote unquote halt the spread of Islam deeper into the heart of Africa. And so when Sudan became independent in 1956, it was basically, and I'm being very general here, but it was basically divided between a predominantly Muslim north and a Christian and indigenous religious south. Um, and so Southern Sudanese resisted these efforts from Khartoum kind of to encourage Islam and Arabization. And so South Sudan fought two civil wars against the Sudan. Hundreds of thousands of people died, hundreds of thousands went into exile. And after protracted negotiations, South Sudan finally becomes independent in 2011. But to your point, the issue, though, here is that even after South Sudan became independent, South Sudan itself unfortunately suffered its own civil war, which forced a lot of South Sudanese refugees to go up north into the Sudan. And so, to your point, now you've got some South Sudanese refugees of this most recent civil war within South Sudan, you know, being forced to go back south into the very country, right? Their home country, but their home country that they most recently fled. Um, in addition to those refugees, right, along the western border of the Sudan, that Sudan shares with neighboring country Chad, you have had hundreds of thousands of Sudanese refugees going into Chad, right, because of some internal conflict in Western Sudan. And so that's just to say that you now have Sudanese and South Sudanese refugees in Sudan proper, in South Sudan, um, Chad to the west of Sudan, and of course, Egypt to the north of Sudan. But then also, you've got refugees who have been leaving the country through Port Sudan, on the kind of northeastern coast of the Sudan, and going into Saudi Arabia. And so obviously this has birthed an enormous humanitarian crisis, right? There have been reports about people not having access to, you know, medicine that they need to take care of their diabetes, right? Um, Running water is low, electricity is low. And so you really have what is essentially a Sudanese conflict that is in danger of becoming a broader regional humanitarian crisis.
And I think that's important perspective. And I want to say that we are currently, so if we bring it to today, Nick, that we're in Jeddah, there are talks in Jeddah now. So Saudi Arabia has a vested interest in Sudan. I was reading your piece, I think, because of the agriculture, because the opportunities for agriculture, and you mentioned oil, for trade, certainly. But the U.S. is also there. So can you, so the U.S. is obviously interested in the region because of the humanitarian crisis, some of the resources you mentioned. Why are the U.S. and the Saudis, what are they doing, and how can we, bring this home to the doorstep, and why we need to be more involved here at home?
That is a great question. So there are multiple reasons why the U.S. There are multiple reasons why the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have a vested interest in what's going on in the Sudan. And I'll start with the United States. To begin, Sudan is very central to Russia's war effort in the Ukraine, right? So, since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, we know that there have been a host of international sanctions against Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation, right? But what's very interesting is that the Wagner Group, right, which is this basically Russian private paramilitary group that has ties, however directly or indirectly, to Vladimir Putin, you've had Wagner Group operations going on in the Sudan, right? And why the Wagner Group is in Sudan is because they're interested in Sudanese gold, right? The two main kind of people at the center of the conflict, G- General Al Burhan and General Dagalo, right, or otherwise known as Hameti, who is the head of the Rapid Support Forces, um, both of them have taken over Sudanese gold mines, and there was basically a discovery of gold back in 2017, and there was this rush, right, to basically control these gold mines. And so since 2017 and 18, there has been Wagner activity within the Sudan. And the idea is that Russia is basically using Sudanese gold to insulate itself from the impact of these international sanctions related to Ukraine. And so, why the US would be interested in this, right, is in essence, so long as that pipeline stays open, right, so long as Russia is still able to kind of lean on Sudanese gold to protect its economy in the wake of its operations in the Ukraine operations can continue. So in some ways, Sudan is this kind of represents, this kind of proxy, right? This kind of potential reservoir of energy to fuel Russia's war effort. But then there are two other reasons why the U.S. would be really interested. Well, possibly three. I'll just say those that come to the top of my head. Right. One is that Sudan is a signatory of the Abraham Accords. Right. So as Israeli relations kind of warm up to some of the Arab League member states, the Sudan included, right, there's a way in which Sudan represents one of these countries that, since the fall of Bashir in 2019, is seen as an Arab nation that is at least warming up its relations, its bilateral relations with Israel, right? And so there is a desire, right, for the US, obviously, to have as many Arab nations that are friendly with Israel, right, this nuclear power as it can, right? But then there's also the kind of foreign policy matter of terrorism, right? We know that Al Shabaab, right, has been headquartered in Somalia, which, while it doesn't border the Sudan, is still within that kind of Horn of Africa region. And so the idea is, the more unstable things get within the Sudan, and the more that this becomes a kind of regional crisis, the greater the possibility of organizations like Al Shabaab taking advantage, right? And then the third reason, and this connects back to the whole geography piece, right? Is the fact that the US has a Navy base in Djibouti, right? Djibouti, which also borders the Red Sea. And so the idea is, the more unstable things get in the region, the more vulnerable this Navy base at Djibouti becomes, right? And this Navy base in Djibouti is obviously important because it's on the Red Sea, it's close to the Persian Gulf, right? And so the US really wants to protect its interests there. As we all know, the economy, not just in this country, but around the world, is still recovering, still borderline in the throes of this, kind of pandemic related recession. And so any instability on the Red Sea also kind of, has the potential, right, of really messing with the supply of, kind of world trade and the supply of energy. So those are just some of the reasons why the US in particular is really interested. And then for Saudi Arabia, we know that the Saudis are very much interested because after al-Bashir was overthrown in 2019, the Saudis and the UAE really stepped up their investment in the Sudan, right? In their attempt to kind of, bring a sense of calm and normalization within the region, right? Um, the Saudis have been in, well, both the Saudis and the UAE, right, have had their eyes on the Southern Arabian Peninsula, excuse me, and in particular, the civil war that has been ongoing in Yemen, right? And so they have been kind of trying to, fight off or fend off these Houthi rebels, which are said to have ties with Iran, right? So for all these reasons and more, the Saudis would like to see someone in charge in the Sudan who is also on friendly terms with them as well. So Those are just some of the reasons why the U.S. and the Saudis are interested. And last but not least, because I think as an historian of religion, I can say that this should not be marginalized either. So Saudi Arabia is obviously the country, right, where millions of Muslims each year make the Hajj, right? And so long as things are disrupted in the Sudan, that is going to impact the amount of people who can travel to Saudi Arabia to make the Hajj, because Port Sudan is one of the primary ways that Muslims from places like Nigeria and elsewhere in West Africa are able to make that trip, right? So you're also, there's a way in which the conflict in the Sudan, by affecting access to Port Sudan as well as the airspace above Sudan, there's a way, or there are ways that is going to have a very direct impact on, which Muslims around the world, not because of financial right reasons, but because of security reasons, are able to participate in this practice that is very central to their faith.
I think it was great, Tatiana, that you mentioned Map of the Modern World, Professor Pirtle's old course, because maps and mindsets are really important here. Chris, as I hear you lay all of this out, we think of the importance of Sudan. It's part of the Abraham Accords, which is critical to U.S. strategy in the Middle East of trying to normalize the relationship. Sudan, along with Egypt, are the western end of the Indo-Abrahamic corridor from Sudan and Egypt to Saudi Arabia and the UAE to India, and from there to South and East Asia. The oil trade, the gold trade, how this plays out with Russia, how this affects security for the Hajj and for pilgrims. And it really indicates that, Sudan sits at as you opened with, it sits as a keystone between a number of key regions of the world. And then I wanted to bring this back to Tatiana's original question, which is, given that all of this, one would think that there'd be a lot more coverage of Sudan. Is it that we just, in the West and in the United States, we have put Sudan in a Africa box that is separate somehow from the rest of the world? Maybe, Tatiana, this is why Al Jazeera is giving so much better coverage, because they have a better understanding of how Sudan is positioned and why it matters in all of these things. And we're at a point today, gold prices are going up, oil prices are going up. Chris, you mentioned, we still are shaky post COVID, and we know what happened the last time we had a blockage in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, what that did for trade and for goods and services. One would think that there would be a lot more reporting on this, because this seems to be touching a number of doorstep issues, and yet it isn't, or at least, again, 6 o'clock news and the like. So, coming back to Tatiana's earlier question of, where should we be looking for sources on this, and a sense of why this issue doesn't seem to be getting the coverage that it ought to be getting, given Sudan's critical role, sitting, as you said, at the intersection of North, West, and East Africa, but across from that to the larger Middle East and the Indian Ocean.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that two-pronged question. One, in terms of where Americans should be getting, or can and or should be receiving their news on this, I absolutely underscore the importance of Al Jazeera. I am not paid by them, but I absolutely do believe that they are the kind of news media organization of record in that part of the world. I have been watching them throughout this crisis. They still have a reporter on the ground in Khartoum, right? reporting regularly. So absolutely them, right? The conversation, right, which I think is a really good source because all of the content put up there are really put up by experts, right? So not people who are, assigned to a particular part of the world 1 month and then perhaps, reassigned when a different hotspot emerges elsewhere, right? But um, if one goes on the conversation, right, they can read news pieces and think pieces by people who are professors of that particular field, right? To read a piece written by someone who has been reading and writing about Ukraine Russia relations for the last 20 years, right, is going to provide a certain depth and texture that someone just recently assigned since 2021 might not, right? And that's no knock or judgment against that. It's just to say that there's just it's just it's just different. Okay. um but while you were talking, I was also thinking about how important journalism and bias, right, is here. Because for the Sudan in particular, I think that since kind of the early 2000s, right? Um, Post 9/11, and as the world became increasingly more familiar with the Darfur crisis, I think that Sudan became kind of the Western face, if you will, of African chaos,
Mhm.
corruption, child soldiers, genocide, all of the kind of familiar tropes that we on this call are familiar with, right? And I think that Sudan, in that way, in the kind of Western media imagination, is really emblematic, right? Obviously incorrectly, but emblematic of the continent as a whole, right? And so if I'm watching, the local 6 o'clock news or, the 6:30 evening news on any of the kind of major news outlets, right? If for the 90 seconds or 2 minutes of coverage that Africa receives, more times than not, it's going to be for, a conflict, a human rights abuse, something that's just not great news. And so I think that we've seen this in the Sudan since mid-April, right? There was, yes, lots of coverage, right? I would say between April 15th and maybe April 20th, right? Um, but as foreign governments started to evacuate their citizens, right, there was this concern voiced, right, that when those foreign nationals were evacuated, you know, basically foreign cameras would go to other news stories, and that the Sudanese who remain would be basically left alone, that the cameras would go away, and then the abuses would really become worse because the eyes of the world would no longer be on Khartoum, right? Um, and so my wife is a communication scholar, and so I'm also just like thinking about, yeah, just how central the importance of media is here, right? Media, and I mean, I don't have to tell you, Tatiana, right? How important that part is, but I think it is so important because it does shape how people think about entire countries, societies, religions, policy, right? And so moving forward, I think that the 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 good thing, well, the it's good, but it's also obviously potentially dangerous, right? Is that there are an abundance of sources that one can have access to, right? Some are more trustworthy than others, but I would say certainly, you know, Al Jazeera is pretty good. Um, um, the AP is pretty consistent. So yeah, and then last but not least, and this has actually been talked about recently as well, but social media, right? For all of the flack, I think deservedly so, um, that has been directed at organizations like, I'll just say Twitter, post Elon Musk stuff, right? Um, Twitter has become an amazing source of information for people in and outside of Sudan, right? And so there's a way in which social media plays no small role here, right? In terms of what we know, in terms of what is going on in the country, right? What airports are, safe, not safe, what roads are good to travel on or not. And so I think that social media can become one of these spaces, not just for reporting what's good, what is going on, but also continuing to shine a light on the country, even when some of the, three acronym news networks aren't.
I'm so glad you brought up social media. That's like, I'm obsessed. But I am obsessed because you cited an article on Twitter. And by the way, I'm off Twitter, everybody, because I can't stand Elon Musk. But I was so intrigued by the hashtag Keep Eyes on Sudan, which you mentioned. And the article you also mentioned, digital campaign to save the people of Sudan, how diaspora communities are plugging the gaps left by international aid organizations by arranging for help. I just thought that was so empowering because all we hear, as you say, is we hate Elon Musk. He's just Twitter's a disaster. Yet this hashtag and the people that are, as you say, communicating internally in the country where to get resources, what to do, but also there's a huge Sudanese diaspora here that it is also able to communicate. And I was fascinated by this because I feel I'm Ukrainian. The Ukrainian diaspora has phenomenally driven and elevated the conversation about Ukraine in this country. And I feel like there's a potential for the Sudanese diaspora to also do that. Um, you know, and there was one quote from that article that you said, what we're seeing worldwide is not just people feeling they need to help, but also being able to help because of this organization, like the Sudanese American Physicians Association, getting
Yep.
supplies. So I'm wondering what you're seeing from the diaspora front and Sudan. Is there this groundswell? What are you seeing that we need to be seeing? Because there are Sudanese in our communities.
Sure. So I will say that as someone who is on Twitter, there has been an incredible way in which people who are in Sudan are describing, like, giving day by day accounts of this happened to me here, this happened to me there, right? In terms of these Sudanese diaspora, it's also been good to see um, Sudanese talking heads on these major networks that non-Sudanese pay attention to. Just yesterday, I saw one interview given by a Sudanese professor at McGill, but what was great about it was that the venue was Democracy Now, right? Um, there is a Sudanese diaspora in Australia, right? The UK, um, Canada for sure, and throughout this country, in places like Pittsburgh and DC and Omaha, Nebraska, San Diego, right? Um, and the counterintuitive part about it all is that, in many respects, the Sudanese diaspora that could be so important in shining a light on the crisis in Sudan now was actually created by the Sudanese civil wars of the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, right? So certainly, I think that there is a way in which not only through financial capital, right, can members of the Sudanese diaspora, whether it is, literally sending in remittances to friends and family in the country who are now really, really struggling, right? But then also, right, um, staging protests, at colleges and universities, right? Writing editorials in newspapers, being active on social media, right? The really unfortunate piece about this is that, you know, within South Sudan itself, we know that freedom of the press is not really a thing, right? It might be enshrined on paper, but reporters have gotten arrested, right, for saying unsavory things about President Salva Kiir, right? So I think that there's a way in which um, Sudanese civilians outside of the Sudan can actually have a very big role in putting pressure on their foreign governments to do everything that they can, because it's a really untenable situation. And the consensus seems that the best possible solution is that neither Hemeti or Burhan actually be in power. And so, you know, it it might have to come down to Sudanese civilians, right, really leading the forefront in terms of calls for there being civilian-led democracy in the country.
I think that is a great optimistic note to leave our conversation for today. But I hope to have you back as we continue to look at this situation and explain the importance of this great country. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Sure. And thank you both for having me.